Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. You've probably heard that Canada has implemented a freeze on handgun transfers. Now, I did talk about this previously, but I'm getting a lot of questions, so I figure it's time to do a follow-up and explain what's going on and some of the impacts. So let's have a look at the changes to the regulation. So it notes that the conditions for transferring firearms and other weapons, Regulations 1, are amended by adding the following after Section 4. So this is, sort of inserting this into the existing language. Handguns. The Chief Firearms Officer may authorize the transfer of a handgun to an individual only if the individual needs the handgun. Now, the only if language basically means that these are just restrictions. This is just limiting the transfer. There's nothing in there that that gives anything back. There's no compromise here. So first, A, to protect the life of that individual or of other individuals. Now you might be wondering, why is this in there, given that Trudeau has just recently said, hey, you can't defend yourself with a handgun in Canada. Well, that's not actually true. There are provisions. It's just really hard to get this particular authorization. They issue almost none of these. I do have a video that I'm planning to do talking about what that looks like in order to get an authorization to carry for protection of your own life. But they did put a specific exemption here so that if you do get that authorization to carry to protect your life, you can buy a handgun for that purpose. Of course, the question is going to be, where are you going to buy that handgun from? Because retailers probably aren't going to be selling them. You may have to, at that point, undergo the process of importing it from the States, which is going to be a real hassle. So next is for use in connection with his or her lawful profession or occupation. Now, there's plenty of people who get issued a sort of a permit to carry a handgun with connection to a profession or occupation. And the most sort of common or notable example of that is if you're an armored car driver, where you're, transporting sums of money and, you need to carry a handgun for that reason. So that would still be permitted under this. However, not all of those organizations have people sort of purchasing their own handgun. Some of them have people, the organization has the guns, so it's not entirely clear sort of how that's going to work. And the next one is C, to train, compete, or coach in a handgun shooting discipline that is on the program of the International Olympic Committee or the International Paralympic Committee, and the individual provides a letter to a chief firearms officer from a provincial or national sports shooting governing body indicating. Now, I'm just going to note here just how much delegation of Canadian law basically happens here to first the International Olympic Committee and the International Paralympic Committee, because now if they, for instance, decide to drop handgun shooting from the Olympics, well, then you can't get a gun for this, even if, for instance, you have dedicated the last, 20 years of your life to serious training. This is something that really is important to you, that you do a lot of. Well, the Olympics dropped it, so tough. Nothing for you. So the other thing that they're sort of delegating a lot of power to here is the provincial or national sports shooting governing bodies, because they're going to get to decide when they get to issue these letters and when they won't. And that'll have direct legal consequences for the specific individual. Now, these sports shooting governing bodies are not they're not elected, they're not even appointed by government, but they're effectively going to be able to exercise a lot of governmental power. That I've got some issue with. So I don't really like what they're doing here. I should note that there are lots of handgun shooting disciplines in Canada that people are pretty serious about. In fact, that some people have made a professional career of, that they're, very serious at, that aren't on the Olympics. So this is going to very much narrow the sphere of sort of what they consider an acceptable sport. So this letter has to indicate three separate things. First, that the individual trains, competes, or coaches in such a discipline. Now, I want to stop here and point out that we've got a bit of a bootstrapping problem, because let's say you want to get into Olympic shooting. Well, you don't train, compete, or coach in such a discipline when you're just starting. So how does somebody start? Because, Olympic shooters don't just, they don't hatch out of eggs. They don't sort of just magically appear. Uh, you know, they're not something that you find with a leprechaun's gold or something like that. They start from people who decided to take up a sport and decided to try it from nothing. So I'm hopeful that these governing bodies will sort of accept the notion that somebody who wants to train or compete or coach in such a discipline might also qualify here. The next is the specific discipline in which the individual trains, competes, or coaches. So they want to really narrow that down, and that the handgun that the individual seeks to acquire is necessary for training, competing, or coaching in that specific discipline. So they're really trying to narrow down what kind of handguns people buy, for this. And this is their hope, at least, is that this is going to be very incredibly restrictive on this. Now, the next is a transitional provision, and this one I've been getting a lot of questions about. So section 4.1, that's all the stuff that I just read of the conditions of transferring firearms and other weapons regulation, does not apply in respect of the transfer of a handgun to an individual if the transferor sought the authorization of the chief firearms officer as defined in section 2.1 of the Firearms Act, that's just the chief firearms officer, to transfer the handgun under paragraph 23.2 sub 1 sub d of that act before the day on which these regulations come into force. So basically, if you had a transfer started, and what that means is started with the chief firearms officer. Now, that's you got your paperwork in, or you made the call and got that initiated. It doesn't have to have been completed. It doesn't even have to have been sort of, the paperwork doesn't have to have been processed. It can be sitting in a fax machine somewhere or in an email box, but just so long as it went in before this was implemented, then that transfer will still be processed, which means that the hold times at the chief firearms officer's office aren't getting any better for the next little while. But there are some people who asked some additional questions here, like what happens if I tried to initiate an application like this, but the chief firearms officers basically said that they wouldn't process it, that they wouldn't accept the application. Well, that gets into an interesting legal question, and one that would probably have to get sorted out by the courts. So that's a difficult one. There's other people who've had, family members die, and then the question is, well, the death precedes this, but the paperwork hadn't yet been processed. And again, that's another interesting legal question as to how that would end up working. And a lot of these end up being really fact specific as to sort of the individual circumstances. So I can't give legal advice here as to what these look like. Lots of people were sort of saying, well, what happens if I paid for it beforehand, but the paperwork hadn't been started? And this almost happened to me because I actually bought a matched pair of firearms, and the company, I'm not going to name them here. I'm not trying to call out it was just, they're dealing with so much stuff that stuff happens. But they actually sent in the transfer application for one of the guns and forgot to do it for the other one. And thankfully, I sort of noticed that and called them up and said, hey, what about the other one? And they got that started. But if I hadn't done that, then I would have been eligible to receive one of those guns and not the other one, notwithstanding the fact that I bought both. And some gun companies are already issuing refunds, but that'll be between you and the company, because theoretically, you can be the legal owner of a firearm that you cannot register to yourself, because registration and ownership are actually different concepts. So this is going to be something that a lot of people have to sort out and work through, and lots of headaches for lots of people. Now, a lot of people have asked, well, how come they implemented this so suddenly? And this is especially true because they had promised retailers that retailers would get some advance notice so that they could, take steps to make sure they had no inventory. and the retailers did not get the advance notice that they were promised. Well, we've had a couple of big scandals that just sort of broke. One of them is the ArriveCan app, which, has been sort of a major thing. It's been revealed that a bunch of the companies that were sort of indicated as being part of this, well, some of them that were specified to have gotten these contracts actually didn't. So there's real questions as to where all this money went and how, and whether, say, it might have ended up in the pockets of sort of friendly people to the Liberal government. That's one scandal. The other one is that the audio tapes, some audio tapes were leaked of RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki, I'm not sure how it's pronounced exactly, basically indicating that she wanted very specific messaging about the killing in Nova Scotia to support the government goals. So that's itself a major controversy. I'm going to be digging into that one a little bit more in another video, but I don't think it's any coincidence that just as soon as these scandals break, suddenly it's, oh, we've got a big announcement with 3 simultaneous press conferences to reveal this. This is, they've been saving this in their back pocket as a media dodge, and that's what they're getting here. And I mean, I guess I'm playing into it too, but I didn't want to make this video without including these details, because quite frankly, then that would just be playing into what they're going with here. So yeah. Another question people have asked me is, how does this affect lending of firearms? It doesn't. There's nothing in here about firearm lending. So everything that could be done in terms of lending before can still be done. Now, there's also provisions here about authorizations to transport. And this specifically refers to transporting a handgun from a port of entry. So a port of entry would be, a border crossing, an airport, a port, any of these things where people come into the country. And it notes that you can you can get an authorization to transport, which is of course necessary to move it from that port of entry to anywhere else, only if, first, the individual holds a registration certificate for the handgun that was issued on the basis of an application that, before the day on which this provision comes into force, was made in accordance with Section 54 of the Act. So again, if you've got a registration certificate from before this. B, the individual possesses an authorization to carry the handgun under Section 20. So that's the carrying for protection or for the purpose of protection of life or occupation or the like. C, we have the same requirement for training, competing, or coaching in a handgun shooting discipline that is on the program of the International Olympic Committee. And then there's a further thing, D, in the case of a non-resident individual, a customs officer confirms under Section 35 of the Act the declaration and authorization to transport referred to in that section in respect of the handgun. So that provision actually is kind of interesting because they've said that there won't be any possibility for firearms to cross the border. Well, it will be. I mean, this is actually a provision that allows Americans specifically to bring guns into Canada. Well, not specifically Americans, but foreigners who are not, not Canadians. And Section 35, I'm just bringing that up here. So that's authorization for non-residents who do not hold a license to import firearms that are not prohibited firearms. And they may import a firearm that is not prohibited firearm. So they can't bring anything that is banned, no full auto or anything like that, or short-barreled handguns. The short-barreled handguns thing is something that trips up American visitors to Canada all the time, because a handgun that is a perfectly legitimate firearm in the US is considered, super illegal here. And they have to be 18 years of older. They have to declare it to a customs officer in the prescribed manner and it has to be on a specific form with specific information. They have to produce an authorization to transport the restricted firearm. So there is a bit of a bootstrapping problem here in that you have to, but I suspect that's going to be resolved just by kind of ignoring it. And So they confirm, the customs officer has to confirm the declaration. This is basically just one of the ways that people can bring guns into Canada if they're not Canadian residents. So this is usually used for people who want to, for instance, come to Canada to participate in a tournament or something like that. So that's what that's there for. So all of this is just newly coming into effect, and again, they dropped this on us sort of as a surprise. There were lots of people who were expecting to get some notice on this, and we didn't. And so, yeah, as I said, I have my theories as to why. I'm going to go into some of that in future videos, but lots of people were wondering what this means. Another question that's been asked a lot, before I forget, is what happens with inheritances? Because people have been saying, listen, I've got, all of these firearms. In some cases, they have collections that are internationally renowned or, worth tens of thousands of dollars or more. And they're saying, well, I was hoping to pass this on to my children. And, my kids shoot with me. This is part of our sort of traditions and part of what we do. Can I still pass that on to my children? And unfortunately, there is no exception for that in the law. So they can only pass things on to, their children if they fit some other criteria. The other thing is that this applies to individuals. Businesses may have other things, but right now, most businesses don't have a whole lot of need for your firearms. Because if you're saying, oh, well, I'll transfer all of these guns to a Canadian business, well, what are they going to do with them? Because they can't sell them right now. So, yeah. Anyway, in terms of what this will do for safety, probably not a whole lot. Because, quite frankly, the people they're targeting here are not the problem. I see people saying, oh, well, this could put a dent in straw purchases. If you stopped every straw purchase that happens in Canada in the average year, that's still not going to make much of a dent. This is a very sort of small impact on the number of firearms, illegally in Canada. One smuggling trip would counteract all of that. So, and the thing is that the criminals have these guns because they want to use them for illegal activities. They want to use them as part of drug dealing, particularly. So, they're not the illegal handgun market. The criminal use of them is primarily driven by that demand. It's not limited by supply because we don't have good ways to stop them from being smuggled into Canada. We, at best, the estimates are that they catch a tiny fraction of the gun smuggling. So this isn't going to slow things down in the slightest on the streets, but it'll do a lot to destroy a lot of, sports shooting, and it'll also do a lot to basically steal money from orphans and widows, and people who are grieving, whose family members have just passed, because a real part of this, a real sort of unstated goal of all of this, is to reduce the number of handguns in Canada by seizing them from people without compensation, just by waiting for them to die. So, yeah, anyway, that's sort of an explanation of what's going on and what's happened. If you have more questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'll try to go through and answer them sort of as best I can, although right now with the kind of stuff they're pulling, I'm pretty busy. But I will try to go through and have a look at those. Please like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to see more content. I also want to thank my Patreon supporters. There's a link to that in the description below if you want to join them. But yeah, at the $50 level, Canada's National Firearms Association, the CCFR, and the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. At the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited and Jane Babe and Luxor. And at the $20 level, Mark, Haywire, Dale Nesbitt, Cameron Johnson, Andrew Elsich, and Vicky. Thank you as well to my $10 supporters who will be in the crawl immediately following. Thank you for watching. I hope this has armed you with knowledge, and See you next time.